Coming up on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto this week, with the federal government still shut down and two political parties still blaming each other, a White House whisperer shares that a decision on rescheduling could come before the end of this year because it's, quote, good politics. And while lobbyists appeal for support from the industry and consumers, we talk exclusively with the Executive Director of MPP, the Marijuana Policy Project. His name is Adam Smith.
But our primary concern for me is not only to end prohibition, but to end prohibition well. And ending prohibition well means that we have a legal regime that is grounded in public health, in public safety, and public access.
And an Ohio judge puts the kibosh on that state Governor Mike DeWine's executive order to ban the sale of THC-infused hemp products. And in Oregon, the man responsible for shooting two people during a robbery of a cannabis dispensary has been found not guilty. And Nebraska regulators miss an October 1st deadline for awarding of licenses, but still manage to issue two for cultivators. Advocates are growing frustrated in the Cornhusker state, where over 70% of voters voted and approved the medical marijuana program last fall. We'll hear from Krista Eggers from Nebraskans for Medical Marijuana.
They violate the statute. They are in complete violation of the law. Voters, patients, the state, 71% of people spoke very, very clearly that they want medical cannabis.
Target will be carrying THC-infused beverages in legal adult use states, the first major national chain and big box store to do so. All that and our international reports on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto next.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News, WPCM-TV's weekly reports on the fight to end cannabis prohibition in this country and around the world. I'm Alaina Pinto. Even though all is quiet on the federal front since the government is still closed for business, the latest from Washington, D.C., as reported by Marijuana Moment, is an unnamed White House insider calls cannabis reform, quote, good politics. Unquote. That same staffer shared that President Trump sees how cannabis reform could benefit Republicans ahead of the 2026 midterms. In the meantime, lobby groups are out trying to drum up support from consumers and business. After all, at some point, the government will have to reopen. Both sides of the political aisle continue to point the blame finger at each other for the impasse. In reality, many federal employees have been laid off, and there's been a walkout of journalists at the Pentagon based on an information block controlled by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. Our executive producer, Jimmy Young, was able to land an exclusive interview with the executive director of the Marijuana Policy Project, Adam Smith. Here's Jimmy.
Thanks, Alaina. So happy to have the Executive Director of the Marijuana Policy Project, Adam Smith, here as our exclusive lead interview on Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Adam, I was so compelled to reach out to you after I read your newsletter earlier last week. And I want to know, is that an industry call for help more than anything else right now?
Well, it's really a call for the industry and advocacy to be a lot more strategic and to look at the big picture and to figure out where our strengths are. We're sort of running all over the place. And while everybody waits for the federal government to come in and magically solve this problem, which is not happening, the states are where everything has always happened in cannabis. And even if the feds decide to deschedule tomorrow, the states would still decide whether and where cannabis could be sold and how it could be sold in their states. Most of what industry needs, I mean, it would be great to get descheduling and tax relief and potentially interstate commerce, but most of the rules that affect industry are still going to be at the state level. And so it was a call to industry to understand that advocacy has not only played a big role in getting us where we are, right? We have an industry that was born from a movement, right? And I point out in the piece, which is an open letter to the industry, that a lot of industries put a lot of money into advocacy on issues that the industry themselves cannot be credible on, right? And they call that astroturfing. They set up organizations and they fund them and they make it look like they have grassroots support. We come from a much more pure place. We have an industry that was born out of advocacy, and that advocacy was born out of real suffering and real and real loss, right? And that is a much healthier, right? You have advocacy, which breeds freedom, which breeds opportunity, which breeds industry, right? And here we are. But as that happened, the philanthropists that funded the launch of all this have faded away. Some have died. And they looked and they said, okay, the industry's here and now they can take care of it. And then industry began to struggle. And what you've seen is that you've seen the advocacy space shrink and shrink and shrink and get to the point where it is almost to the point of being shrunk to not being effective. And so what the letter was a call to industry to understand that while they can talk about dollars and cents, it gets very hard for industry to talk about things like public health and safety credibly because they have this profit incentive. And what advocacy does is we talk about the entire plant. We talk about it from a good policy standpoint without that profit incentive. And so it's the combination of advocacy and industry that can move this forward. And we've sort of lost that. So this was a call for a reconnection of the broader movement between advocacy and industry, and to really think about where we need to put resources and how we can strategically attack this problem across states. That may be a longer answer than you were looking for, Jimmy, but here we are.
That's all right. No, but it was very articulate. You're awesome, Adam. I appreciate the time, and you obviously know what you're talking about. You've been in the trenches. The most obvious next question is, how much has the government shutdown hurt this movement?
I can't speak for what it's done for industry, right? And I'm sure I'm about to go to Washington, D.C., and I'm sure a lot of people out of work there, and I'm sure it's not helping, anybody's industry, although cannabis tends to be somewhat resilient in the face of recession because people reach for it, in times of crisis. So I'm not sure that it has hurt the movement, but it certainly is something to talk about the federal government, other than the tiresome will they reschedule to Schedule 3, which I'm about done with listening to.
Well, yes, and yet that still would at least give legitimacy to the fact that this is a plant medicine,
100%,
and it will help 280E. It's better than nothing. It's about a little bit, not much more than that, right?
I don't mean to downplay it, but it is.
I understand.
But it is a half measure. It is something that the industry has spent a lot of time thinking about.
We'll have the rest of that interview on Thursday, when we usually publish our one-on-one special reports for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
In California this week, Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed a bill that would have allowed medical patients the opportunity to get cannabis delivered to them at home. Medical-only cannabis dispensaries are not exactly thriving in any state that has existing adult use legalization. That side of the industry has seen its market size decline. That puts many medical-only dispensaries in financial jeopardy and are barely surviving. The governor's reasoning for this veto was the cost of expanding its track and trace system that would have been just under $270,000, a mere pittance for the largest cannabis market in the U.S. You might remember that last week, the big story was in Ohio, where their Governor Mike DeWine used his executive powers to enact an emergency ban on the sale of THC-infused products from hemp. This week, a judge blocked that move, and right now, Ohio is right back where it was before Governor intervened. That's not the only news about hemp. The big story is that Target will start carrying THC-infused hemp beverages in their store, the first big box store to carry these products where they are legal. Kerry Hinkle has more in this week's Hemp Report.
I'm Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp out of Houston, Texas, and I'm back again with another Hemp Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This week, we turn our attention to Minnesota, where Target has launched a pilot program of hemp-derived THC beverages. Now, they're launching in 11 stores. They're carrying 5 milligrams and less on potency, and they have started with 12 brands. Now, some of those brands are local to Minnesota, like Trail Magic and Shirley Brewing. There's also some national ones, like Can and Senorita, which, of course, is owned by the MSO Green Thumb Industries. Now, We've seen in the last few years as this category of hemp-derived THC beverages has exploded with major alcohol retailers like Total Wine & More and ABC Liquor in Florida, Benny's in Chicago, among a handful of others that have started to carry these beverages. But Target's the first real behemoth S&P 500 large publicly traded retailer to dip their toes in the water of carrying these products. And what's particularly interesting is where they're started. Now, of course, Target is headquartered in Minnesota, but Minnesota also has one of the most robust regulatory schemes for all things hemp. They have hemp-derived THC beverages on draft in stadiums. They have licensing and regulations in place that have allowed for this industry to flourish in the state, so much so that a retailer like Target can feel comfortable enough to say, yes, these products are legal. Yes, there's clear consumer demand. And yes, we want to offer them, especially as we see alcohol and other SKUs in that retailer, but among others, have started to decline. And so hemp-derived THC beverages are clearly here to stay. And we'll see if Target starts to get involved to defend the right to sell these products. But for now, it's a huge win for the industry. And we will see what big retailer is up next to start carrying the products. Again, for Bayou City Hemp and for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Kerry Hinkle. We'll see you again next week.
Now let's hear from our Ohio correspondent, Christina Brisson, and her take on the dog and pony show going on in the legislature in her state, something they are all starting to get used to. Here's Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina Brisson with Over the Top Renovations with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm working on trying to make my presentations a little more personable, a little more candid, so let's try this and see how it goes. And let's talk about what's going on here in Ohio. So recently, Judge Carl Levine has blocked Governor Mike DeWine's order to ban Taska hemp products, which would have lasted for 90 days, at which point the Ohio General Assembly would have had a chance to extend or end said ban. Now, this also involves a rule that would invoke a $500 per day fine for these stores that didn't have it off the shelves in time. Additionally, 3 businesses sued DeWine as soon as this order was issued. So now we're about to see what's going to happen. This block will only last for 14 days. We'll see what's presented. And let's talk about the reality of the situation. Do I think there should be regulation on intoxicating hemp products? Absolutely. Do I think it's going to hurt Ohio businesses with what's going on right now? Also, absolutely. We need to come to some sort of medium agreement. We can't have everyone that can pay $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 for a license for a dispensary, but not be able to sell it a product. So let's find a medium that protects our public, makes people safe, and also doesn't hurt Ohio businesses. I am Christina Brisson with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Over the Top Renovations with Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
In New York, the Office of Cannabis Management offered 2 opinions on what to do with the battle between local municipalities and states in regards to the opening of cannabis businesses. Case in point is the town of Southampton that has had quite a few dust-ups with licensed stores who have opened without town approval. The New York State Licensing Board believes the state should dictate where dispensaries are allowed to operate. The dispute over jurisdiction in Southampton will surely end up in court focused on the opening and then closure of the Charlie Fox dispensary. But in Michigan, that's not a problem they have anymore. But there is another major issue that is now heading to court. 2 weeks ago, their governor, Gretchen Whitmer, signed a 24% increase on wholesale sales tax of cannabis in order to fix the roads and bridges in that state. Now, advocates are taking the state to court to block the implementation of that hefty tax hike. Here's Amie Carter with the Michigan Report that is now being supported and sponsored by Wally's Wonder World of handmade, customizable humidors.
This is mold on wheat. This is mold on weed. And this is what this Wonderworld plant is supposed to look like. Do you want to make sure this never happens to your precious flower? Check out the handmade humidors by Fenton, Michigan craftsman Gregory Johnson. Each humidor can hold 1 ounce of your stash, and it comes with a Boveda humidity pack. You care about your flower, so protect it inside a humidor made with American-grown maple, cherry, or sapele wood. Check out their website at wallyswonderworld.com. There you'll find the famous award-winning Hakuna Matata No Worries Humidor. You'll also find a variety of humidors with different designs. They even customize accessories like doobie tubes, grinders, and even a classic roach clip from the 70s. Treat your stash with class with a custom-made, handmade humidor from wallyswonderworld.com and never worry about moldy weed again.
I'm Amie Carter from Michigan Wheatsters with this week's Michigan Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Sure seems like things in Michigan are going up in smoke. We thought things were bad last week, but they're even worse now. A set of bills have been dropped by the Senate, and there are groups both supporting it and in opposition. Michigan Senate Democrats have introduced a major package of legislation aimed at stabilizing the state's multi-million-dollar cannabis industry, which now faces a newly approved 24% wholesale tax. The bills referred to the committee this week target two main areas. Senate Bills 597 and 598 propose a new statewide cap on retail licenses, limiting them based on population, roughly 1 per 10,000 residents. This is a dramatic change from the current voter-approved law that allows for unlimited licenses set only by local communities. The Michigan Cannabis Industry Association strongly supports this. Director Robin Schneider said unlimited cultivation licenses have created oversupply, causing wholesale prices to plummet, financially harming businesses and all the way down the supply chain. However, critics like Jamie Lowell, a legalization advocate and a Michigan Wheatster board member, opposing the bills, calling it a major unnecessary rewrite of a voter-approved law. Secondly, unregulated hemp products, Bills 599 through 602, would extend the regulatory framework to consumable hemp and ban the importation of untested, intoxicating hemp-derived products. Proponents say this protects public safety and stops untaxed products from undercutting the legal market. In April 2025 decision People v. Armstrong, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the smell of cannabis alone is no longer sufficient probable cause for police to search a vehicle due to the drug's legalization for adults. However, the court is continuing to review critical cases such as People v. Freddie Wilkins to clarify the limits of the new rule, particularly when a traffic stop involves occupants under the age of 21 years of age. In the Wilkins case, the core legal question is whether the odor still justifies a search when the occupants are too young for legal possession, an issue where the defense argues the common smell of marijuana doesn't prove who, when, or if a law was illegally broken, while the prosecution contends that the under 21 status makes any possession illegal and justifies the search. The court's final decision in the Wilkins will further reshape the Fourth Amendment rights regarding cannabis in the state. Remember, the fight's not over. It's not legal until every person is free from fear of prosecution, until every caregiver and doctor is protected, until every last prisoner is released and reunified with their family. We have to stay united. That's it for this week. Hopefully, better news next week. I'm Amie Carter with Michigan Wheatsters for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The Michigan Report is sponsored by Wally'sWonderworld.com.
The Journal of the American Medical Association published an editorial this past week calling for medical doctors to be more informed about the medicinal benefits of cannabis. The editorial pointed out the facts that even though cannabis is still wrongfully placed in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, JAMA stated, quote, "It is no longer sensible for clinicians to remain willfully ignorant. Medical cannabis is here. Will physicians catch up, or will we, through omission, continue to let patients navigate therapeutic uncertainty alone?" Unquote. The editorial goes on to state that doctors should get instruction on the endocannabinoid system. They should also have a basic understanding of pharmacokinetics of THC, CBD, and other minor cannabinoids. Plus, they suggest risk profiles, dosing and titration methods. The publication also urged doctors should understand the legal regulations and strategies for patient-centered communications and shared decision-making. The Journal of the American Medical Association is published in Boston, Massachusetts, the state that Curtis Emery reports from every week. Here's Curtis.
I'm Curtis Emery, a bud tender from Resonate in Worcester, Massachusetts, with the Bay State Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. A breaking story here out of Massachusetts. The CCC has uncovered that the regulatory body itself has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees with very little description, some listed as general services, and one egregious amount, $200,000, being spent on, well, there's no description on what that money was spent on, just that it was spent on legal fees. Now, the lack of transparency itself is enough to raise alarm, but the amount of money that was spent on these non-traceable transactions or insufficiently detailed transactions is quite alarming, and the CCC has a long way to go to prove these expenses and make it right for the public. Also, a continuing story here in Massachusetts, Suffolk County Sheriff Stephen Tompkins has asked that his extortion case, his federal extortion case, be thrown out of court. Now, Tompkins, who was arrested at the end of the summer on extortion charges, he was alleged to have extorted some money that he invested in a Boston-based dispensary and demanded that money be returned to him. Tompkins' lawyer, however, said that part of the agreement was that he was due the money that he put in and whatever he might have earned on top of that, and therefore engaged in no nefarious schemes to get that money back. He was just making good on the agreement that he thought that he had had. It should be interesting to see where this case goes next. I have been Curtis Emery with the Bay State Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
That'll do it for the first section, or A block, of this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. We have plenty more reports coming up, including our international segments. Plus, the jury has reached a decision in Oregon on a double murder of 2 robbers at a Portland dispensary. Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this.
Your cannabis business could be overpaying by hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal income taxes because of one simple assumption that you're making about your accountant. A dispensary owner in Colorado called me frustrated as hell. He'd been working with the same accountant for 3 years. His accountant said, "What's 471C?" Here's what the ignorance of that accountant was costing this business owner: $180,000 every single year for 3 years. 471C has been around since 2017. We're talking about an 8-year-old tax provision that many cannabis CPAs don't fully understand. 471C is one of the most complex and highly debated tax strategies in the cannabis industry. If you want to make sure you're not leaving any money on the table, I'm offering free 471C reviews this month. Link in the description.
Accounting Buds has grown into Buds Group, the same award-winning quality, now with more service offerings. Buds Group, your best buds in the biz.
Looking for PR that over-delivers on expectations? At Maverick Public Relations, they pair big agency experience with personalized attention. From launching award-winning brands to securing top-tier media hits, their data-driven communications team helps visionary leaders and entrepreneurs rise above the media noise. Maverick PR is responsive, collaborative, and relentless about results and ROI. Visit themaverickpr.com and make headlines together.
If you want to make history, if you want to be part of history, if you want to say you helped legalize marijuana in America, now is the time to join us.
Welcome back to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This is the B block, or second section of this week's news show. I'm Alaina Pinto. Last month, we reported on the German company Viterial that had completed a research study that concluded that cannabis was a much safer alternative treatment for chronic back pain. That clinical trial was the first time in European history that a multi-compound cannabis medicine passed the rigorous RCTP, or randomized controlled trial procedure. In this week's Prohibition Partners newsletter, editor Ben Stevens believes that the significance of this milestone, quote, risks of being underplayed, unquote. The study could pave the way for cannabis to be more accepted by the entirety of the European Union. With more from Europe, and specifically the UK, here's Dave Barton, followed by Debi Facey in Canada.
I'm Dave Barton from Thermador with your UK Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. A UK cannabis clinic has set up a dedicated women's health service amid reports that NHS waiting lists for conditions like endometriosis and perimenopause are reaching crisis levels. Alternatively, the clinic in question has set up the service in response to a 50% increase in female patients every 3 months. The clinic's medical director, Nabila Chowdhury, said that she was determined to take a robust approach to women's health and address medical misogyny. Reports show that there's a broadening gender care gap here in Britain, which private clinics are poised to fill, as conditions like heavy periods and endometriosis are often dismissed by NHS doctors. Raising awareness of the positive effect that cannabis can have on women's health continues to be an ongoing challenge globally. Or as Nabila Chowdhury puts it, while it won't be for everyone, cannabis is a valid option for thousands of women suffering from common but life-altering conditions. That's all for this week's UK Report. I'm Dave Barton from Thermidor reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
This is Debi Facey with the Canadian Coast to Coast Cannabis News Report. So what we have in Canada this week is the OCS has awarded over $527,000 through a 2025 Social Impact Fund, which is going to be promoting 6 programs throughout Ontario, which is going to be amazing, especially for the newcomers that are wanting to be entered or want to gain access to the cannabis industry and doesn't necessarily have the right directions. So what we have in the OCS, they are going to be launching the workforce and safety. They are going to be promoting education, equity, youth engagement, and environment substantial across the whole Ontario, which is great. The initiatives include safe for use education from Guelph University, harm reduction for Black communities in Salud College, micro-credential on cannabis workplace safety, and the mentorship incubator for women in the Cannabis by Hire Collective. The youth environmental projects also include Students Commission Participatory, which are going to allow students to put in their input when it comes to developing structured information, especially when it comes to drug use and harm reduction. What we also have is the strike in British Columbia. So the BCGEU strike has shuttered all of provincial liquor and cannabis stores as 23,000 workers demand 8% wage hike, sparking an industry-wide concern. This is something that is also impacting the cannabis industry and some of my personal allies due to the fact that their LPs are not able to deliver or gain access to the cannabis that they need. So this is creating a shortage in their supply. Hopefully everything works out sooner than later, especially with the season changing and with our coming up to, I think, 5-6 years? Man, I can't even know. But either way, our anniversary is coming up, which I'll make sure to highlight for you. This is Debi Facey with the Canadian Coast to Coast Cannabis News Report. Peace.
One of the most shocking cannabis news stories last year was the report of an attempted robbery of a dispensary by 2 men who were shot dead by a store employee. This week, the trial concluded when the employee, Jason Steiner, was found not guilty in the double murder case. Steiner, who was working alone at the dispensary at the time when 3 men, armed, broke into the dispensary and started to rob the store. Steiner, who turned himself in 3 days after the incident, told the 3 perpetrators that he made his purchase and was leaving. A few minutes later, he returned with a gun and shot 2 of the 3 robbers, who were both under the age of 21. Surveillance video supported Steiner's account, and he was acquitted of all charges. Marianne Cursetjee has more in her Oregon report.
I'm Marianne from Alibi with the Oregon Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. An Oregon cannabis wholesaler has filed another legal challenge to Oregon's protectionist state cannabis laws. This lawsuit seeks to challenge the prohibition on interstate commerce by using the Dormant Commerce Clause. If this suit is successful, it will upend the current state-based cannabis regulatory framework. This is an uphill battle for sure. Also, in the news is a verdict on the case from a year ago, reported here, where a dispensary worker, where 3 men entered a dispensary to rob it and threatened to kill the employee with the firearm. The employee was able to exit the dispensary and shot and killed 2 of the 3 assailants. A jury found the dispensary worker not guilty of murder. I'm Marianne from Alibi with the Oregon Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
In the District of Columbia, medical cannabis cultivation sales declined 8% from the record month of May this year. For the first time, sales of vapes surpassed the $1 million level, with infused edibles declining. However, the one place where there was a significant uptick in sales was in concentrates, where they were up 78%. Now let's check in with Tina Taska in Nevada and with some interesting developments from the indigenous tribes in the cannabis market. Here's Tina.
I'm Tina Taska with 420 Technologies and Iconic Representation, and this is the Nevada and Tribal Nations Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Planet 13 Holdings, the Nevada-based cannabis company, best known for its world-class Las Vegas superstore, has just opened its 34th Florida dispensary, this one in DeLand, perfectly positioned off the busy I-4 corridor between Orlando and Daytona. This strategic location strengthens Planet 13's growing footprint across the Sunshine State, continuing its mission to bring premium cannabis experiences and exceptional retail design to the community. Researchers at UNLV have developed a new class of THC-free CBD-like compounds using carvone, a natural molecule found in caraway seeds, as a chemical foundation. In preclinical studies, these compounds, especially one called Plus CBD OCT, significantly reduces seizures, lowered seizure-related deaths, and improved healthy brain cell growth without the sedative side effects seen in many current medications. Published in Neuropsychopharmacology, the research could pave the way for more accessible seizure treatments that don't have to rely on cannabis plants. This is an exciting step forward for patients who have exhausted existing treatment options, said Dr. Dustin Hines, UNLV neuroscience professor and study co-author. Our goal is to design CBD-inspired medicines that are more effective and affordable for families facing epilepsy. In tribal news, Todd Thompson, an Ojibwe man from the White Earth Band, is challenging Minnesota's authority to prosecute cannabis offenses on tribal land. After recreational marijuana was legalized in 2023, Thompson kept selling cannabis at his shop, Acima Tobacco and Pipe, citing treaty rights and tribal law. Despite warnings, he was charged with felony possession. His case hinges on Public Law 280, which limits state power on the res and could set a major precedence for state tribal cannabis boundaries. That's it for the Nevada highlights and tribal nations. I'm Tina Taska with 420 Technologies and Iconic Representation for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Even though the federal government remains closed and reforms and rescheduling are getting pushed further and further away from the list of priorities, the race to be the 25th adult use legal state continues. Pennsylvania is still the odds-in favorite to get it done, and their governor, Josh Shapiro, is waiting for his legislature to find a way to pass a bill so he can sign it. In the meantime, there is a palliative care bill making its way through the State House in Philadelphia. The Compassionate Access to Medical Cannabis Act, also known as Ryan's Law, would allow patients who receive treatment in hospitals to continue to use prescribed medical cannabis. The bill, sponsored by Senator John Kane, is named in honor of a California man who used medicinal cannabis during the final weeks of his battle with pancreatic cancer. Next up, the battle for acceptance in the state of Alabama, where Jennifer Boozer Stewart hosts a weekly radio show called Cannabama. Here's Jennifer with the latest from her state.
I'm Jennifer Boozer Stewart reporting from Alabama for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This week, the Alabama Alcoholic Beverage Commission, which is now the regulatory board in charge of the hemp industry, released their new rules and regulations that coincide with the passage of HB 445 in May of 2025. Now, they did remove the requirement for drinks to have an additional childproof cap, saying that a pull tab is federally compliant, similar to beer. And they removed the requirement that all beverages be kept in a locked refrigerator because larger grocery stores complained that they could not afford to have a dedicated employee standing around waiting to unlock a refrigerator. But now, in order to get a license from the ABC board, you must have a signed letter of approval from the town you want to do business in. And some towns have already imposed a 1-year moratorium on any new ABC licenses. So established hemp businesses in those towns will be put out of business because they cannot even apply for a license starting January 1st. Also, now you cannot advertise outside of the business or have any signs indicating what's inside. We don't know what that means for our logos, many of which have a cannabis leaf or partial cannabis leaf in the logo. It could also mean that I cannot keep doing my radio show if I do plan to open my dispensary again once these rules and regulations shake out and I'm able to apply for a license. Packaging cannot contain imagery for personal items, such as clothing, cell phones, earbuds, and ink pens. No idea what that is even for or where that even came from. There are also new types of licenses that limit what you can sell and where, and square footage requirements for retailers as well as grocery stores allowed to obtain a license. For example, a dispensary has to be a minimum of 500 square feet, and a grocery store has to be a minimum of 14,000 square feet to obtain different licenses. Each business will need to have a $25,000 surety bond before applying. The ABC board is approved now to do random searches and checks and created a monthly meeting to punish and prosecute anyone they believe is outside of the rules. Plus, it says, in any investigation, all evidence will be destroyed whether the individual is found guilty or innocent. So under a false report, they'll destroy your inventory afterwards. It also strictly bans any lounges, public consumption, samples, giveaways, or events based around hemp hosted by hemp companies. No more 420 in Alabama, y'all. There's also a requirement to submit inventory data and tax information every month to the ABC board, plus a yearly review and license renewal, where they could suddenly deny or shut you down at the start of any year. This is just more and more egregious rules added to a vague bill that is completely unconstitutional, harming businesses and the citizens of Alabama and the state tax revenue. Roll Tide, y'all. This is Jennifer Boozer Stewart reporting from Alabama for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The FBI released their 2024 record for the arrests this week, and the results continue to be alarming. Over 190,000 people were arrested in the last year for cannabis possession crimes, despite the 40 states and Washington, D.C., who have decriminalized the plant medicine. Even though the totals of cannabis possession crimes has fallen in recent years, NORML's Deputy Director Paul Armentano said, quote, hundreds of thousands of Americans continue to be arrested annually for low-level cannabis-related violations, even though a majority of voters no longer believe that the responsible use of marijuana by adults should be a crime, unquote. In Arizona, there was a major lawsuit that got dismissed, and Karen Black has that story.
I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting with the Arizona Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Arizona's cannabis licensing drama just hit a major turning point. A Maricopa County judge has officially dismissed the high-profile lawsuit accusing Governor Katie Hobbs, her chief of staff, and the state health department of improperly awarding a marijuana dispensary license outside legal deadlines to a subsidiary of Trulieve. The suit came from Arizona Wellness Center owner Mason Cave, who alleged the governor's team cut a backroom deal with lobbyists tied to Trulieve to secure a dual-use license for Sherry Dunn LLC. But Judge Joseph Creamer wasn't buying it. He ruled the plaintiffs didn't have standing to sue, and even if they did, there was no violation of law or the Arizona Constitution's gift clause. In short, the court said there was no proof of favoritism and the state was within its rights to settle a licensing dispute that had dragged on for years. The decision should put an end to months of speculation and appeals over how Arizona's dual-use program is enforced. But Mr. Cave's legal team hasn't ruled out one last shot at appeal. Turning now to another legal showdown, the U.S. Supreme Court is poised to address whether cannabis users can legally own firearms. Justices have declined one case, but will debate others this term that could redefine Second Amendment rights for medical marijuana patients nationwide. And here in Arizona, a top cannabis attorney says the state's own patients could be central to a landmark ruling if the justices take it up. Meanwhile, the hemp industry isn't sitting still. Arizona producers are back in court over the state's ban on THC-infused hemp consumables. The Court of Appeals granted them a temporary lifeline, halting enforcement of the ban while the case continues. Industry leaders say these products are vital to keeping family-run operations alive. And on Capitol Hill, Arizona hemp processors are joining other states in urging President Trump to block Congress from recriminalizing Delta-8 and similar hemp cannabinoids. They argue a crackdown could devastate jobs and investment tied to the legal hemp market. Now for business news. Cannabis retail sales across Arizona dropped nearly 13% year over year in September, but you wouldn't know it from the activity on the ground. Missouri-based Franklin's just launched its premium blunt line into Arizona shops, betting that quality still wins even in a crowded marketplace. And despite the economic chill, new dispensaries continue popping up across the valley. Story Cannabis just launched its Litchfield Park location October 8th. Jars Cannabis debuted in Anthem earlier this month, and Zenleaf is celebrating its grand opening in Chandler this weekend. Clear signs that even as overall sales cool, Arizona's cannabis investors still see plenty of green in the Grand Canyon state. That's all for this week's Arizona Report. I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The cannabis industry is constantly fighting for respect at every level of government. The unjust tax code structure of the 280E clause that doesn't allow the industry to write off normal business expenses, including payroll, is the biggest injustice, and it will go away if cannabis moves to Schedule 3 of the CSA. Every other industry in the country enjoys that benefit, but not cannabis. So then there's the licensing discrepancy between cannabis and alcohol. In Colorado, the first-time licensing fees for cannabis companies is 735% greater than the first-time costs for liquor licenses. Jenny Germano has more on just another unfair, prejudicial rule for cannabis.
I am Jenny Germano with ICS Consulting. This is the Colorado Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Durango's cannabis dispensaries are raising concerns. In a recent city council meeting, officials discussed the substantial differences in licensing fees between cannabis dispensaries and other businesses. For instance, while a new retail cannabis business pays $10,000 in licensing fees, a new liquor store will pay just $1,197. There are also differences with renewal fees, with dispensaries paying $8,000 compared to liquor stores' fees of $422.50 when it comes to renewing their license. City Council person Kip Casso described this imbalance as an unfair fee burden left over from the early days of legalization in Colorado. The city implemented these higher fees in 2014 during a time when retail cannabis was unexplored and daunting for municipalities. However, as the industry has matured in Colorado, questions are being raised about the fairness of these fees by licensed operators. The deputy city clerk noted both liquor and cannabis licenses are more time consuming to maintain than other licenses, requiring 15 to 20 hours annually for staff. The City Council is now considering a reevaluation of these fees to ensure they are equitable and reflective of the current landscape in Colorado. I am Jenny Germano with ICS Consulting, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
That will wrap up the B block, but we have one more section to go. And in this one, executive producer Jimmy Young tracks down one of the most outspoken advocates in the state of Nebraska, where Nebraskans for medical marijuana continue to fight political leaders to finally deliver what the voters passed by over 70% of the vote in the last election. We'll introduce you to Krista Eggers when Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this.
You know, in the state of Nebraska, this issue has been going on for over a decade, where advocates, led the fight, went to the legislature year after year. We walked away empty-handed, no change in leadership.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Young, and it's time for school. That's school with a K. I love the name of this platform because it's the first course I'll be teaching where spelling really doesn't count. It's how words sound, how you pronounce them, and how clear your speech is. Do you have the mumbles? You know what I mean? Do you have the dreaded itis, gap fillers? The course is called Teaching Generation Text to Talk. I've done this for decades as a professional broadcaster on TV. I've even won an Emmy Award as a sports talk show host for a kids show I co-created in the 1990s for the TV channel that I worked for in Boston. I'll also be offering a free 1 hour, once a week call-in show where you could just join me to ask any questions you want. I've got a background in sports, so I love to talk about that, but I've also built a network for one of the most controversial industries in modern society. That's right, it's the cannabis industry. I'm the executive producer of the nation's only TV news-style show called Cannabis Coast to Coast News with the very talented Alaina Pinto. Now, it's all about learning how to talk, to speak, to communicate like a broadcaster. It's epic! So join my community that I'm calling the Forever Young School of Communication. Sign up for the first course, Teaching Generation Text to Talk. And for now and forever, I'm Jimmy Young, and I look forward to talking to you.
Welcome back to the C Block, or final section of this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Alaina Pinto. In Oklahoma, the deadline is nearing on collecting enough signatures to get the adult use legalization question on the ballot. That's also the state where there is a new law that goes into effect on January 1st of next year, requiring all physicians to take 6 hours of training courses before they can be certified medical practitioners. Kimmy Cannabis has more from Oklahoma.
I am Kimmy Cannabis from Can I Talk About It with the Oklahoma Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Back on August 6, 2025, the Oklahoma Responsible Cannabis Action, also known as ORCA, began gathering signatures for State Question 837, a critical initiative that could reshape Oklahoma's cannabis industry and protect small mom-and-pop businesses statewide. Now, with the November 4th, 5 p.m. deadline quickly approaching, it's crunch time. ORCA needs to collect 172,993 valid signatures to secure its spot on the 2026 ballot. And every single one counts. But remember, accuracy is everything. If there's even one mistake on a petition page, that entire form gets thrown out, and all those signatures are lost. So please let someone experienced handle the form to make sure it is filled out correctly. This measure is about keeping the heart of the Oklahoma cannabis industry alive, protecting local operators, ensuring fairness, and giving the people a voice in how this industry grows. Time is running out, so get out, sign, and share. Small mom and pop businesses across Oklahoma are depending on your support. That's it from Oklahoma. I'm Kimmy Cannabis. Peace, love, and all that good stuff.
One of the scariest facts about the cannabis industry is the amount of debt that many multi-state operators have to deal with, including notes that come due in 2026. One of those companies is Curaleaf, and this past week, they prepared for that by getting a loan from one of the most cannabis-friendly banks to the industry, Needham Bank. Needham is a suburb of Boston, about 10 miles west of the state capital of Boston. And Curaleaf was able to get an extension of their credit from $40 million to $100 million, extending the maturity to up to 5 years. Curaleaf's CFO, Ed Kramer, recognizes that, quote, "This is the first of its kind transaction of this scale in the cannabis industry and was backed by the direct support and strong conviction of our leaders in our business and future. It represents a significant step toward broader access to capital markets and signals progress toward establishing financial standards in a sector that has historically limited institutional participation," unquote. Now, let's check on the publicly traded cannabis stocks with Doug Miller, who is always high on Wall Street.
I'm Doug Miller from High on Wall Street with this week's Cannabis Stock Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Curaleaf, one of the largest MSOs, is gearing up to report its next round of earnings on November 5th, and all eyes are on whether the company can keep that momentum alive. Investors will be watching for revenue growth, especially in newly opened markets like New York, and international sales, which have become a bright spot in recent quarters. Curaleaf last posted over $300 million in revenue, with margins improving. So the question is, can they sustain that pace in a slowing consumer environment? Analysts are also zeroing in on cash flow, debt management, and whether infused products like new Anthem Bold pre-rolls can boost revenue. With legalization hopes and regulatory shifts still in the spotlight, Curaleaf's guidance could set the tone for the entire cannabis sector. So let's see how the stock chart looks. It was trading around $2.86, and it dipped down on Friday. So we'll be watching how it sets up going into these earnings. And that is this week's Cannabis Stock Report. Reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Doug Miller.
Did you know that the state of Nebraska only has one group of legislators? It's called a unicameral legislature, where only one single chamber or house where all the lawmaking powers live. They are the only state in America with this kind of system. And that's the system that Nebraskans for Medical Cannabis has been battling ever since voters passed a ballot measure last fall to decriminalize the plant medicine and establish a viable medicinal market. The head of that advocacy movement is Krista Eggers, a mother of two, who is watching how her state government is doing everything possible to launch a medical program that most lawmakers never wanted in the first place. Executive producer Jimmy Young caught up with this passionate advocate this week.
Thanks, Alaina. We're so happy and honored to have someone who has been instrumental in the advocacy movement in her state of Nebraska. Her name is Krista Eggers. It's Eggers, right? It's a hard G.
It's Eggers, yep.
Okay.
Yep, that's correct.
Wanted to make sure I could get the Krista part very easily. So appreciate you taking the time. It seems whenever I have a story about Nebraska, you're quoted. So I knew that this was a good person to talk to. And this week, they're starting very slowly to distribute and award licenses, but even that has been a little painful. Can you give me a little background on what's happened over the last week in Nebraska?
Yeah. So in Nebraska, after voters passed medical cannabis ballot initiatives, those ballot initiatives put together the Medical Cannabis Commission. This commission consists of the current liquor control commissioners that serve on medical cannabis, and then the governor appointed 2 additional individuals to this commission. The commission is tasked and has the authority to regulate the dispensing, the growing, cultivation, manufacturing of cannabis for medical patients. So what they were up against a deadline of October 1st, on or before they were to start distributing licenses. What we saw them do this last week is they did move forward. The cultivator license application process was open. There were 39 applicants. They went ahead and they drew 4 in a lottery. 2 of those individuals were awarded licenses and have accepted those licenses. At this point, we don't know if they're going to move forward with manufacturing. That's what they have said they're going to do. But the commission themselves is unfortunately very, very dysfunctional. We are seeing a huge amount of opposition from political forces, really strong arming this commission. And what is happening is not at all reflective of what voters passed. This commission is not listening. There was a public comment yesterday that happened in Lincoln regarding the rules and regulations they have set forth. And it's very clear that the rules and regulations they have proposed that will become law on December 7th, approximately, they violate the statute. They are in complete violation of the law. Voters, patients, the state, 71% of people spoke very, very clearly that they want medical cannabis. They want a comprehensive program. They do not want restrictions on the type of cannabis or the form of cannabis that they, it's available to them. And this commission, one time after another, has truly just stripped away the voter intent in this. So we're working very hard to really oppose what this commission is doing. Your guess is as good as mine whether they're going to move forward and make any changes, which the public comment was very strong that they need to make changes. I don't know if they do. I sure hope they do, because we are just really walking ourselves into, a program that is very segmented, a supply chain issue just from day one. There is not any experience on this commission. It is full of cannabis prohibitionists. So we're up against a lot, but just continuing to make sure that these people are held accountable. The voters put them in this position, and they answer to voters in what they're doing. And again, we're seeing them not do that right now.
And welcome to the world of legal cannabis in America, because the government, whether it be the feds, the states, or the towns, are doing everything they possibly can to make it as difficult as possible to survive, let alone launch in a state like Nebraska. And on top of that, your leaders, your governor and your attorney general specifically, has tried very hard to go against what the people wanted. And that bothers me as an American more than anything else, because the ballot box has always belonged to the people. And this issue brings people out more than any other issue, because everybody has an opinion about cannabis and how it should be used, regulated, and unfortunately, it falls on deaf ears with a lot of the other elected officials. However, you guys still have the vote in your hands, and you can take notes of everybody who's fighting you and work to get them removed, because that's the only thing that can ever happen on this.
100%. We've got to pivot to elections. And, in the state of Nebraska, this issue has been going on for over a decade, where advocates, led the fight, went to the legislature year after year. We walked away empty-handed, no change in leadership. And that's why we pursued the ballot. It took us 3 times. We were the first year overwhelmingly successful, made the ballot in a Supreme Court lawsuit, later tossed us. And so, we've continued at this, but the process of going to the ballot, thankfully Nebraska has that, because I can tell you that there's no way that we would have legalized medical cannabis if we could not go to the ballot. And what an important right that we have.
There are a few stories related to Minnesota. One involves a bust. Another involves the wrongful firing of a construction worker who failed a drug test after using his prescribed medicine in off hours. And the third story involves the challenges of procuring a location for a dispensary and the unfair practices of making licensees obtain a lease even before they apply for a license. Alicia Bellamy has this week's Minnesota Cannabis Report.
I'm Alicia Bellamy for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This is your Minnesota Report. I'm also with the Minnesota Cannabis College and the founder of Herbs and Herbs. Dominic Krillick, out of Becker, Minnesota, was arrested after a traffic stop. Krillick pled guilty to first-degree cannabis possession after police found 149 vapes, 298 grams of concentrate, 1.5 pounds of cannabis, and $4,000 in cash. Krillick was on probation for firearm and ammo possession with a prior conviction of threats of violence. He was sentenced to 15 days in prison and 5 years of probation. Minnesota's own Target brand stores are now selling cannabis beverages. Texas-based home builder sued for rescinding a job offer over the use of medical marijuana. The Minnesota man applied, interviewed, and was offered the position of sales. The Texas-based company rescinded the offer after the pre-employment drug test showed the presence of THC. Minnesota law allows both medical and recreational use during non-work hours. Most employers are barred from testing cannabis, say the Minnesota lawyer defending the plaintiff. I'm Alicia Bellamy for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This is your Minnesota Report.
In Illinois, September was a bad month in cannabis sales. In fact, with only $154 million in sales, it was the second worst month this year. Mark Allen, the Chicago clone guy, sees declining revenue, but that's not stopping his passion for launching his clone farm. Here's Mark's Illinois report for the week.
What's up, everybody? I'm Mark Allen, the Chicago clone guy, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, just outside of Chicago, Illinois. I'm in the clone castle right now. Sorry, it's a mess, but I've been building this thing on my own, trying to put it together on my own. It's been interesting, a lot of fun. Anyways, always something to talk about here in Chicagoland. The Cannabis Research Institute kicked off its its second annual public research series. Long story short, they're letting the public come in and talk to them and have comment and voice their concerns, because the goal of the Cannabis Research Institute is to make cannabis research transparent, accessible, and collaborative, which is exactly what the government does all the time. But it is pretty cool. It seemed like a good meeting. Interested in hearing more about it. More news about the Illinois Department of Agriculture is actually going to also do something similar. They're going to be hosting public hearings for rule changes to the cannabis law. Specifically, they're going to be proposing changes to the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. I don't know what that means yet. I'm going to find out the details, but to me, it kind of sounds like money. It's about money, but that's okay. They're actually, you can register online. You can speak to them through like a webinar, or you can go in person in Springfield. It's coming up actually pretty soon. So I'll report on that after it happens, but that's pretty cool. So the person leading that presentation is actually a neurologist that is an expert in cannabis research in neurology with his patients and whatnot. So that actually is pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to learning more about that. But that sums up the news for Chicagoland, Illinois. I'm Mark Allen, the Chicago clone guy, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
And finally tonight, even though Halloween is still 11 days away, we want to share with you some tips from Dr. Benjamin Kaplan from Massachusetts. He gives parents some tips for making sure your Halloween experience with your trick-or-treaters is safe, and it's all about preparation and education. Make sure you store any edibles like medicine in a locked medicine cabinet or other child-safe storage container. Most cannabis products have THC warnings on them, so inspect the candy before you let your child have their treats. Separate your own stash of edibles from any candy, so there is no mix-up when you talk to your kids about the potential for bad adult tricks. Talk calmly to your children with soothing tones, not panic. Don't scare them. There is plenty of that everywhere, but most is in good fun. Enjoy the holiday and be safe. That's this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Alaina Pinto. Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Consume it responsibly, and we'll see you next week.
I think I messed up. Did you know there's a place that covers all the cannabis news you need? Pro Cannabis Media is now WPCM-TV, your go-to website for things cannabis. WPCM-TV is the CNBC of weed, bringing you the latest news you need.
Amie Carter. This week, she reports from inside the State House in Lansing.
I'm Amie Carter from Michigan Weedsters with this week's Michigan Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
And talk shows about all things cannabis.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all you're doing to get the word out. Like, this show is so important.
It all started back in 2018 when Emmy award-winning talk show host Jimmy Young kicked it off with the In the Weeds podcast.
That it's not just any generic paper towel. You do have a brand that you use, right?
Yeah, we live or die by the bounty. I mean,
the quicker picker-upper. I love that.
His mission? Building an army of multimedia journalists and podcast hosts who are documenting the fight to end cannabis prohibition in this country and around the world. Fast forward to today, and we've got the nation's only weekly cannabis coast-to-coast news program with Alaina Pinto.
Hi everyone, welcome to this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News, WPCM-TV's weekly production of the fight to end cannabis prohibition in this country and around the world. I'm Alaina Pinto.
Delivering the nation's only TV news-style program. Since June 2021, WPCM-TV has racked up over 1.3 million views, with 17 million impressions, and picked up over 16,000 subscribers on YouTube alone. For more information, contact the team at WPCMTV.com